Hi everyone, welcome to the Conscious Core podcast, and this is Kriti Shastri, your host. So, if you are someone who actually knows that a lot of people have put in their job application, around 100 people have put a job application, and you already know that you have to be there somehow, you need to get that job. So, then what is that you should do? Next, you're just about to crack a big business deal, but then somehow you don't get it and you feel bad about it. What is that you need to change in your life? Next, if you're just about to enter college and make your first presentation, and you somehow feel that I'm not confident enough to speak around in front of 200 or 300 people, what should you do? Or you're just a child entering a school and you're just making your first public speaking appearance and you are really very nervous. So, if these are the problems that you've been suffering through all this while, this podcast is for you. I welcome you all to Francisco Mehfuz, and he's the author of the book Bear, A Guide to Brutally Honest Public Speaking, as well as host of Story Power podcast. So he's been a keynote speaker and he is a storytelling coach as well. He offers communication training to international organizations as well as individuals. A very warm welcome, Francisco. I hope the intro was perfect.
It was perfect. I might have even sent you that intro, so I couldn't I couldn't complain if it wasn't. So no, it was perfect. That is who I am and that is what I do. Yes.
Right. So yeah. To begin with, please tell us anything about yourself to our followers. How did you come into the thing of storytelling, and what made you make this your life's only agenda?
Sure. So, you know that horrible dream where you're standing in front of the classroom and everybody's waiting for you to speak and you're just horrified. I mean that's something I lived when I was a kid. I think I was about 12 years old and my 7th grade teacher said, Francisco, can you please come up here and tell a story to the whole class? And then I looked at my classmates, and half of them looked like they were sorry for me, and the other half couldn't wait to see me crash and burn. But as I walked up to the front of the class, I realized that I was terrified, but I was also a little bit excited because I wasn't a popular kid, and I went to this fancy private school that was super expensive, and I didn't have as much money as most of the other kids that went there, and because of that I just couldn't do some of the things that they could do. Like I couldn't buy the same clothes, I could never go on the school trips, and whenever somebody invited me to their house, I was always kind of embarrassed to invite them back to mine, and all of that just made me different. And when you are a kid that age, being different is not a good thing. So as I'm walking up there to tell the story, I get this sort of childish notion of, what if they like my story? What if this is the thing that makes me popular? So I go up there and I tell the story, and it goes great. I mean, they laughed and they cheered. And when I finished the story, they asked for more. And at that moment, I felt like the most popular kid in that school. And that, I think, was the very first time I experienced what the power of stories could do.
Yes, I think that very moment you owned the place. You started owning the school. You started owning the place because you believe that I belong from here.
Yeah, well, I think it's just a very different experience than what you're used to, because I don't think we tend to think of ourselves normally as someone who can command other people's attention. And even if you think you're a nice person and you're a little bit popular and your friends like you, you don't necessarily believe that if you just stand in front of 20 of them or 30 of them and you start talking and you talk for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, they would just listen to you with all their attention. I know my friends wouldn't. So it's a very strange and powerful experience to realize how much a story, and a story you've thought of, a story you've lived through, can command people's attention. So yeah, I think it's something that for those of us, for the people who haven't experienced that, it can be it can be life changing.
Right. True. Very true. Most of our people who listen to us, they also always, they want to know what is that they can do that people start listening to them, right? Be it social media, be it LinkedIn, be it any other social media, they are of course finding ways that people listen to them. And that is what I mean this digital age is all about. So tell us something, how things can roll down in their favor.
I mean, my answer is the most obvious answer I can possibly give, which is I think that if you want to capture people's attention, the easiest way to do it is just by telling stories. Because if you're trying to be engaging or creative in other ways, most times you're starting from zero. Writing is not an easy thing. I think most people that try writing on a regular basis know that it's a difficult thing. Even people that write every day know it's a difficult thing. So to become a good writer, that takes a whole lot of effort. If you're trying to do things with video, for example, I mean, most people are terrified of filming themselves, so that doesn't make it easier. You still have to figure out
I was one of them.
Yeah, you still have to figure out what is it that you're gonna say on a video, and then you have all the technical aspects of editing and lights and all of this stuff, and so all of these different things that you can do are difficult. Whereas a story, you're not starting from zero. You're starting from the hundreds of thousands of years that human beings have been telling stories to each other and liking stories. So the moment you start sharing something that sounds like a story, our brains going, oh, hold on, maybe something interesting is happening here. Maybe I should pay attention to this. And as long as you something happens in your story and it's remotely interesting, people are more likely to carry on reading that just because they want to know what happens, just because they want to know how it ends. So
Right.
it's way easier to be engaging, to write well, and to be creative in a certain way, because whatever happens to you, I think, has only happened to you, right? By its
Right.
own definition, you're being original because you're sharing something no one else has lived through in that exact way. So I think it's not a hack because it's the most common form of communication that human beings have ever known. But for a lot of people, it can feel like a hack. It automatically makes you more original, a better writer, more engaging. So yeah, I think people everyone should tell way more stories on their social media or on their presentations than they normally do.
Right. And I think while they're, telling the story themselves, they start enjoying the process. And the moment they start enjoying the process, all the fear relating to public speaking just evaporates. So that is,
Yeah, so there's a number of things that a story can do when it comes to public speaking. I think one of them is that it's a lot easier to remember. If
right.
you're gonna do a presentation that is half an hour long or an hour long, there's a lot of stuff to remember. Most people don't remember it. Most people put together a PowerPoint and keep looking at the PowerPoint to see what comes next, which is not great at all. So a story makes it a lot easier to remember. It makes it more memorable to the people in the audience. It makes it more interesting for them, and it allows you to sort of forget that you are giving a public speaking presentation. You're just telling the story. And sure, it's always going to be difficult doing that in front of 100 people or 1,000 people, but it's still easier to do that than try to write a presentation sentence by sentence that
and
has to
recite
cover
it.
20 and recite it. So again, you can't have the whole presentation just be a story normally, but if you can have the most interesting parts be a story, it will make everything about presenting in public a lot easier.
Plus, you don't have to remember a lot.
Well, I mean, I think you don't have to remember a lot because stories are a lot easier. I mean, you have to remember, but you don't have to memorize it. But it
Yeah,
does still require practice. I think that just because stories are more memorable than most of the other stuff we do, that doesn't mean we shouldn't practice them. But it is true that it's, if you know what happened, then you're not going to forget what comes next in the story in the middle of it. That's just not going to happen. You might forget what story you're supposed to be telling, but you're not going to
right.
forget as soon as you start,
You
you get to
know.
the end of the story at the very least.
Right. So this is an interesting thing, and anyone who's just for the first time trying to get their first client, or maybe for the first time going for a public speaking and don't know what to do. So this hack might be really, really helpful for you.
Yep, very much so.
Right. So I was reading through your post lately, and I got across that one of the posts that you were mentioning about. You just mentioned about it, like the way we need to tell the stories is quite uh, different from how things happen, and when things happen, you just feel like that this is how it is going to do, or this is how it has fallen into place, this is how you need to make them understand.
Well, the way you tell a story when you're doing it, when you're doing what we tend to call storytelling, it's a little different than the way you just normally tell a story to a friend, because when you're storytelling, you are paying attention to some things that a lot of people don't normally pay attention to when they're just talking to their friends and family. So for example, you want to know what the point of the story is. Why are you telling the story? Because if you don't know the point, then you shouldn't be telling the story. Again, you can tell it to your friends, but it's not really a story, it's just an anecdote. It's, oh, I was outside and this happened, it's funny, blah. Okay, great, but it's not really a story, it's just an anecdote. When you're doing this on social media, on a presentation, you definitely need to know what the point of that story is. If you know the point, you know what in that story is necessary to support that point and what is not necessary. So this is a common thing I see with the people that I work with, is I say to them, okay, just, you have some story ideas there, just tell me what happened. And they'll tell me
Right.
what happened. And then later we're going to say, okay, but if your point is this particular thing, all this other stuff you told me about your father, is that really necessary for that point? And I go, no, not really. Fine, then we can just cut
Yeah.
all of that out. Like all these different characters you had that like if they're not necessary to the main narrative of what you're trying to say, you can cut them out. And then there are simpler ways of telling some things. Like commonly I'll have someone take 30 seconds to get into a story, and I
Right.
say, okay, how do we tell that in a sentence? Like if it's just one sentence, you have to introduce that story. How do you introduce it? Oh, it's a story about this, this, and that. Okay, so how about we start with that, and then you move on to the rest, and then you start editing the story and crafting it, and you end up with something like what you see me do on social media. But if I told that story to you for the very first time, and I had never told anyone or thought about it, it wouldn't look like that.
Right. Right. So, even I was quite scared while I was in my school for the first public speaking exposure. And I believe somehow it just went by. And the next time I realized, okay, you need to prepare a lot before you need to speak. You need to prepare on content, you need to prepare on how the flow of the thing will go. And it all has to happen in your mind before. Right. So this is one thing. So do you need to like if you're telling a story, do you need to actually plan it how it will go? What emotion will you throw in a story, or it just happens?
So the process I follow to tell a story, or to help someone to figure out what the best story how to tell a story is more goes more or less like this. someone tells me, okay, well, this thing happened, and then I'll
Right.
ask them, okay, just tell me what happened, and they'll go through it in it'll take them a few minutes, and they'll explain to me what happened. Then we'll talk about what's the point of that story. Okay, so how, sometimes there's more than one, but how do you think you could use that story? What's the lesson? How did that story change you or change the characters? And then we'll talk about it and say, okay, well, this one is very strong, this point. These other ones maybe not so strong. Let's choose one. Then you choose one point in the story. Then you make sure that the only things in the story are the things that are needed to get to that point, to get to the end of the story. And then you start figuring out things like dialogue. Is there any dialogue that we can have in the story? Instead of you telling us that you talk to your friends, can you actually talk to your friends? What is the best way to start the story? Because usually you want to start with, tell people where you are so they can kind of have an image in their heads, and just some type of action or movement. So you're in the, like movies, movies usually start with a camera. Either the character's doing something, or it's a camera over the water getting into the city, because they
Right.
want movement. So you want
Right.
to start a story where you are talking to someone, you're answering the phone, you're opening a door, you're getting in the car, right? So that's just a way to start the story. And then there are lots of other things that you can tweak. Like, for example, I would always say to people, we need to understand why you care about whatever problem you have in the story. So just give us one line that says why that was important to you. What was the big issue that you're gonna have if this particular thing didn't happen? So that is usually important. And you talk about emotion. I always tell people that they should say how they're tell people how they're feeling. Right? Just say, I was so angry with that because, or I was really sad. I really love that dog, whatever, right? So you don't always need to verbalize the emotion. If you're telling a story on video, sometimes your face is going to do that job, but the emotion is one of the most relatable things you have. Because if you're
Right.
watching a movie about, I don't know, like the Martian, right? The guy that gets lost in Mars and is trying to survive. Like, you're not an astronaut. You haven't been stranded in a different planet before. So none of that stuff is relatable to you. But you might have felt lost, and you might have felt stuck somewhere and you didn't know how to get out. So when you
Right.
express those things in the story, or when you make them obvious in your story, other people go, oh yeah, there was that time I was that job and I couldn't quit because I had this was a really, so it's not Mars, but you can relate to it, and that's all
Right.
made easier if you're telling people what you're feeling throughout the story, because it's not always, we're not actors, so it's not always going to be obvious in our face.
Right. Ajay, tell me one thing. If someone wants, like I said, someone wants to get an interview and that person already knows that along with me there are 100 other people who's applying for it, and he is sitting in front of the interviewer, what should he speak that very moment that can, give him an edge over the others?
So I'm not an interview expert, but the one thing I do know is that interviewers often ask you to talk about your previous experience, or they ask you to describe yourself, or they ask you to say why you think you would be good at that particular job. And what
Yeah.
most people will do is they will give their own opinions about it, or they'll say something like, I'm a team player, and
Yeah.
I've always liked challenges, and I think it brings
I
out the
love
best of me.
challenges.
Yeah, yeah, because nobody else gives that same answer. What you can do instead of that is say,
Yes.
someone asks, why do you think you'd be good in this position? And you say, well, 2 years ago, I was working at whatever place, and this and that happened, and everyone else in my team was like really, like they had no idea what to do, and they were panicking, and I actually enjoyed it. I really like what happened there, because then I did this and I did that, and I learned all these different things by trying to deal with this particular problem, and that's just the type of person I am. Now, what you've done there is you told a little story to illustrate this idea that maybe you
How you
like
did it.
challenges, you're a team player, you're okay with change, And that is going to be significantly more memorable to the
And
interviewer,
impactful.
yeah, than the person who just said, well, I've always been a team player. I've always liked
I love
challenge.
challenges.
Yeah. I'm a team player is the worst
I've
thing ever.
I've heard this a lot while I interview people in my office. So they
Yes.
are the same questions and the same answers. So the way you
Yes.
put it and how you put it really matters.
Yeah, and there's another, and something else you can do is, again, you have to feel very confident about it, but you can do that, and you can even preface that. I don't know how to say this word, but you can before you tell the story, you could say, listen, I could tell you that I'm a team player. And that I like change, like everybody probably does when you ask that question. But let me just tell you about something that happened a couple of years ago in a previous job I was in. All right. So again,
Yeah,
if you're
that makes
confident
more
enough,
sense.
you can pull that off.
Yes, and that makes more sense. People start listening to you that very moment, if not anything else. Okay, so this is how we did it. And suppose you are in a negotiation table with your potential business client, and somehow the client wants it but is thinking otherwise. So, what is that, and how would you do that so that it catches that very moment they agree to it and they're like, okay, fine, I'll do it.
Yeah. So again, negotiation or pitching or anything like that, there's lots and lots and lots of different techniques. Not everything, storytelling is not necessarily the answer, the best answer, or the only answer to everything, but it definitely helps. So I'm not sure it's necessarily at the point where people are getting objections, but the best thing you can do when you're negotiating, when you're pitching someone is, have you lived through something, or have you helped a different person or company that had a very, very similar problem to the one they have? Because if you have, then you can ideally build that into your pitch. And you can say, we work with companies, or we work with people that do this, and that. Like, for example, about 6 months ago, I started working with this entrepreneur, and this is the problem she was facing. And then you just tell that story, and you try to explain what you do through this example of a person that you believe is going to be relatable to whoever you're talking about. And you can build the objections in there. And you can say, so when we started talking about working together, she was really concerned about price. She didn't have that much budget. She was
Right.
concerned that it was going to be expensive.
Right.
I explained to her, and then you build whatever objection you think this person you're talking to now is going to have into that story, and then hopefully the question has already been answered. All right. And if you haven't done that, if you just pitched more normally with features and benefits and all of that, you can always try and tell the story when the person raises the objection. You can say, listen, this concern you have is not something I've never come across. Just a few months ago, I was working with this entrepreneur, and then you're just telling the story anyway.
Yeah, so that is how we do it. Apart from this, how is Francisco as a person, and how did the book writing thing happen to you?
Francisco as a person. Francisco as a person doesn't usually refer to himself in the third person, but
Okay.
so the book writing. So you were asking why I wrote a book, or how did I write a book?
Both.
Okay, so the first one was that when I started looking into becoming a speaker, trainer, a coach, getting into the space, I spoke to a friend of mine who had been doing this for a number of years, and he said, well, whatever subject you decide that you want to sell yourself as an expert on, you should write a book on it. And I said, why do I have to write a book? You never wrote a book. And he said, yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. He hadn't. But he said, the process of thinking about writing a book is going to tell you a lot about this particular subject. You're going to know straight away if you feel you know enough about it, or if you have to do more research. And if you actually write the book, then you're going to have to consolidate a lot of your ideas, You're gonna have to try some stuff out to see if it works, even if it's only in your head. And if you actually publish a book, then you have something that will make you look significantly more like an expert in most people's eyes. So I agreed with him, and I started laying out the book. So my process was, I wrote down every possible thing I could think of I knew about public speaking. Not pages and pages, just the items, like, body language and vocal variety and storytelling and all of the stuff. Then I figured out how I would organize the book. In my particular case, that I'm going to have an introduction. I'm going to explain how the book is laid out. Then I'm going to start talking about where did the ideas come from for public speaking. Then I'm going to talk about the structure of a speech. So that's how I laid out the book. And once I had that structure, those chapters, I started figuring out what of all my bullet points went into each of the chapters. And when I had a reasonable idea of, this is the introduction, then the first chapter is going to have this, 15 things. Then I started writing them. And the way I wrote them, I felt ended up being fairly easy because, I'm picking one point, which I say, vocal variety. And then I was like, how am I going to... So all I always did in my case was, this is the section of the chapter. I have a takeaway. So I would figure out what the takeaway was. And then I say, I want to get to this point. Now, let me write down what I know about this. And then let me think of a story or something a little more metaphor or something a little more colorful to just start that section. So typically it would be, a little funny title, a little bit of a story, and then what I'm trying to teach people, and then a takeaway. So it was a fairly easy process to write. And I committed to doing 500 words a day as a bare minimum. And I was writing every day except Sunday. And sometimes I would write 700 words. Sometimes I would write 2,000. Sometimes I would barely make it to 500. But I did that. And I think in about 5 or 6 months, the whole book was completely written.
5 to 6 months. That's a good one. What about the next book?
So this
is it on its way?
And no, it's not on its way. Well, I mean, arguably, it is because I've written so much content on social media and on my online course and on the podcast through the podcast that if I really needed to put a book together in a week, I probably have most, if not all, of the content I would need for that. But what I haven't decided yet is if I want to do... Because the next book would be on storytelling. So I could very easily just pick... I could do it on all the learnings from the podcast, and that would be very easy to do. I could just do it on what I know about storytelling now. What I'm thinking of doing is something that would take a bit longer. Is I want to spend at least another year or two doing more practical work with clients and companies. So then I could fill most, if not all, of my examples in the book with my own work instead of just picking, a story from Nike or a story from somewhere else, which is a lot of people do when they write books. So I will write another book. I'm pretty sure of that. But I don't think it's happening for another year or two.
Yeah, because it will have the real experiences, the real one.
Yeah. I mean, you can write a book and publish it fairly easily these days. And you can even, there's some very easy tricks to make that book a bestseller. Tricks that I hadn't learned by the time I published my first book. So I cannot claim that it's a bestseller. But I don't necessarily, I'm not convinced that there's a ton of value in doing that. So I rather put out a book that I think stands on its content and it's more than a marketing tool. Right.
These days, if you have a book written in your name, people call it, you they see you as an authority in that sphere.
So one question that I often get asked, and one that is I think a pretty good one, is just people say, so how do I get started? If I want to start telling more stories, I want to get a little better with the storytelling thing, how do I do that? And to me, there's a couple of things that everybody can do that don't take a ton of effort. The first one is to just get into the habit of thinking of a story as a real life example that you use to make a point. So it doesn't matter if it's a presentation, doesn't matter if it's a social media post or something you're explaining to people during training or in a meeting at work. If you have something to explain to them, have you got any examples? And if you have any examples, can you just start with the example and then go into more detail about the thing you're trying to explain? Because if you're doing that, you're essentially storytelling. Okay, there's more to it than that, but this is the process that most people use when you're doing a presentation. You start with a story, and then that story is helping you lay out what the problem is, or what the challenge the company is facing, or what is the thing that you learned over the last year. And then you go into more facts and figures and however else you're explaining or you're substantiating your point. So that's the first thing, is think of stories as a real life example that makes a point. And when you have to explain something to someone, start with the story or the example, and then you explain whatever, with normal
Whatever
sentences.
you need to, right?
Yes.
Whatever you need to explain to them. So
And
that
the
is
other
how,
thing,
right?
sorry, go say what you were going to say. I interrupted
No,
you there.
that's
Sorry.
okay. No, that's okay. The other
Well,
thing you were mentioning,
yeah,
yeah,
the other thing I was mentioning is that the problem most people have with stories, with telling stories, is they don't have the stories, or at least they think they don't have the stories. And that's because, if you ask me, tell me a story right now, I'm going to go,
yes,
well, a story about
what?
what? Well, if you give me a topic, maybe something will come to mind straight away. Maybe it
Right,
won't, right? Because that's not
right,
how the brain works. So what people need to do is they need to become used to collecting stories, or not necessarily stories, but things that happen to them. Like
right.
if at the end of the day you just ask yourself, did I see anything today that was strange or funny, or did I learn anything? Did I read any interesting stories in a book, or see them on the news or in a documentary? And even if you did that a few times a week, you probably put down one or two or three things. And the next thing you know, you have 20 or 30 things that you heard that were interesting, that if they're not a story already, they could be developed into a story. So the next time you have a presentation, you say, okay, I wanted to put something from my personal experience here. You can ask yourself, okay, have I ever done this before? Have I lived through this before? Have I experienced something similar? And if you haven't, then go to your list and go, yeah, there was this
Fine,
thing that happened a few weeks ago, and I think this actually would be an interesting example to use here. And
right.
that's the bit most people don't do. They don't have a story bank, a list of things that could be stories. And then whenever they have to use a story on a presentation or on a social media post, they think they have to invent one or have perfect memory at that moment. But nobody does
Or
that.
to say someone else's story. So they think like that. Either they have to invent or to say someone else's story. So while I was just talking to you and conversing, I remembered an incident which was quite life-taking incident of mine. And I was like, okay. And it was more about spirituality, or maybe it was more about my faith in something. And I was asking God that I want to take a dip in the Ganges. I hope you know that, right? And so somehow I went inside. I was rafting, but then I told so, and I jumped into the river. I was wearing a life-saving jacket, but what happened was, I was asking myself, but still, if I wear a life-saving jacket, how can my head dip inside the water? Right? So how will that happen? I want that. And instantly, within, like, I think 15 odd seconds, within 15 odd seconds, I was under a raft, and there were 12 people on top of me. I had gone under a raft, I don't know how, and I was like, okay, I have to breathe now. And I'm not a very good breather, so I can't do snorkeling as well. So I was under that raft for around 45 seconds, and I felt like, okay, what next? How to come out of it? How to swim across and how to come out of it? Because I can't breathe. First few moments were of fear and other things, and then suddenly, just my thought just shifted, and I said, okay, fine. If this is what it is meant to happen, let it happen. But I'll just fight my way through it. And I think, yeah. So that very moment when I thought this, I got a catch. I could catch my breath because somehow the raft shifted, and I was also on the flowing river, right? So somehow I got a gasp of a good oxygen, and then again I was unsided. And then within few minutes, I mean, within few seconds, another seconds, like 10 odd seconds or 15 seconds, I was completely out of that draft. But that incident really scared the hell out of me. And I was like, okay, I'm living now.
Yeah, so that type of experience is one where you can. There's many different things you can do with it, right? So if you think about it for a long time, you might find some very profound message in there that you can use, in a number of different situations. But it can be even something much simpler. So if your story ended at the point where you realize you couldn't go, couldn't get your head wet because you were wearing a life vest, that
Right.
alone is a story, right? You say,
Yes.
I was really excited, I wanted to do this, I wanted to have this deep spiritual experience of dipping my head, diving into the Ganges. And then as soon as I tried, I realized, I can't, I'm wearing a life vest, right? And
Right.
this could be a story about, the more I tried, the more I failed, and I just kept, bouncing up and down. So it could be a story about how, you are trying to do something, but you are too concerned about the risk, and you're not giving yourself to the experience, or
Completely
something
to
along
it.
those lines. That alone
Yes.
can be the story.
Right.
Without everything that happened after, just that alone can be an interesting story to illustrate a point. Particularly if you're talking to entrepreneurs, I'm sure a lot of people would relate to that. They really want to dive deep into the entrepreneurial river,
Take
but
the
they still
risk.
have the life jacket of a regular job, or whatever it is that they're doing that's stopping
Yes.
them from. So just that alone, without you almost dying, is still a pretty interesting story that you can use it. But if you don't write it down, maybe you never remember it, and one day you go, there was
Right.
that time I almost drowned in the river, right? But if you write it down, you remember it more easily as well.
Yes, and you remember the particulars of the incident as well. Otherwise, after a few years down the lane, you even forget the particulars, like how, what happened, then what happened, the next second, what happened, what was the moment, at that moment, what was rushing through your mind, what were the thoughts which were rushing through your mind. So you forget those after a few years. So yeah,
Yes.
putting down what you experience is an important way in which you can, begin or initiate a talk or maybe communicate with someone, right?
Yes. Yes. Exactly.
So right now, I'm just thinking that we are. There's nothing more I can think of to ask, and probably we might just end with this session. It was great having you here, Francisco, and I really enjoyed every moment with you, wherein we were talking about little details of how stories should be made and how the point is relevant to a story. So that was one interesting work, and I learned a lot, and I thank you for the same. Is there anything you would like to mention about me particularly?
About you. uh, No, I think I think, well, one, you don't need to worry about not having asked every possible question you could ask. Otherwise, we would have been here for 10 hours. I think
Right.
that the one thing I would mention is right at the beginning in your introduction, you talked about very different ways of different challenges that people
Right.
face, and I think it would be an interesting exercise for you, now that we've done this, to try and see if you understand how you would deal with those challenges with a story. Now that we talked
Oh,
about all
wow.
this stuff, because some of them would be obvious. I mean, the answer is always, how do you create an example instead of a
Right.
normal explanation, for whatever challenge you have, at least when it comes to communication. But I think that would be an interesting exercise, because again, with like with writing down the stories, I think once if we listen to a whole bunch of things that are useful about how to tell stories or how to market ourselves or whatever, but there's no practical application soon, we tend to forget it. So I tend to tell the people I work with that like you have to actually do the work and tell a story and write down some stories, because otherwise all of this sounds very useful in theory, but not necessarily. 6 months on the line, you don't even remember what is it that we talked about.
Yes, definitely. So all those 5 points will have a story soon. Thank you so much, Francisco, for your time. It was an honor having you on the Conscious Core podcast. And yes, I would ask all my viewers to watch the Story Power podcast. I've heard a few of them. Yes, please go through the Story Power podcast. I'm sure you'll enjoy a lot and learn a lot out of it. Thank you so much, Francisco.